Hello, good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Tom and I'll be your moderator today. Over the next hour, we'll explore one of the most pressing shifts shaping global business, the acceleration of sustainability regulation across the Asia-Pacific region and what this means for companies everywhere. So this won't just be a policy discussion, it's a story around how governments, business and supply chains across the APAC region are moving from voluntary good practice to enforceable, measurable accountability, and why that shift is reshaping the way we all work. If you have any questions for today's webinar, feel free to put them in the question box. We'll also be recording today's session as well, so you can share that with your colleagues as well. So before we dive into today's session, let me just give you a quick word on who we are. SEDEX helps businesses see and manage what's really happening in their supply chains. For many teams, that visibility stops at tier 1 and turns into numerous spreadsheets and guesswork. We help turn that uncertainty into confidence. With over 95,000 companies that use SEDEX and our SMETA audit methodology, we help them to understand the working conditions, safety and ethics across their global suppliers. SMETA is the world's most recognized social audit. It gives businesses credible, verified third-party data they can trust and act on, owned by SEDEX. We were actually founded more than 20 years ago by global retailers who'd learned, often the hard way, that you can't improve what you can't see. And since then, SEDEX has grown into a global network spanning 180 countries, giving buyers and suppliers one shared platform to collaborate, identify risks, and drive improvement. Now, moving on to our speakers, I'm delighted to be joined by two of SEDEX's leading experts. Charlotte Kincaid, our Senior ESG Policy Manager, leads SEDEX's engagement with policymakers and international standards bodies. Her work bridges business, research and regulation, helping companies translate policy ambition into practical action. And also, we're joined by Isis Bleer, Senior Sustainability Strategist who specializes in making complex sustainability issues clear and actionable for businesses. She analyzes aggregated data from across our global network to uncover the patterns and risks shaping corporate strategies today. Together, both Charlotte and Isis will take us through how the region's regulatory landscape is evolving, where momentum is building, and what it means for businesses operating or sourcing from APAC. Isis, over to you to walk us through today's agenda.
Amazing. Thank you, Tom, and thanks everyone for being here today. So as the EU kind of fumbles its way around with omnibus delays and simplification, and as political contention kind of increases in the US around ESG, our aim was to really understand whether APAC could emerge as the front runner in sustainability regulation. So today we'll be demonstrating how the region has been taking a bit of a staggered path from voluntary standards to mandatory reporting standards, all the way to mandatory due diligence regulations. And then we'll be diving into what these regulations might mean for your business and how you can best prepare for these changes. And that applies to you, those of you here today who are representing kind of large listed firms based in APAC, or even suppliers to these larger firms, really hoping to understand what kind of data requests may come your way. And as Tom mentioned, we'll be taking questions at the end, so please make sure you stay until then if you have any. I will pass it on to Charlotte.
Great. Thank you so much, Isis. And thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to be talking about this really interesting topic and have a bit of a debate around this, whether APAC might actually overtake Europe in being the leader on sustainability regulation. So globally, what we've really seen is sustainability regulation going through a maturity phase. And we typically see this maturity having 3 steps. The first step is really around voluntary frameworks. So that's things like the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, National Action Plans for Business and Human Rights, and also voluntary sustainability reporting standards, such as the GRI reporting standard. And the next step in the maturity spectrum is really about mandatory reporting and disclosures. So these type of regulations require businesses to disclose environmental and social risks in their operations and supply chain. They might require businesses to report on ESG performance and also risks and opportunities. Then the final stage in the maturity spectrum is what we call mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. This is really the most far-reaching type of regulation that requires businesses to not just report, but actively manage and mitigate risks related to ESG in their operations and supply chains. And we've seen Europe really being the leader in this historically. So starting off with the voluntary frameworks in Europe. So the UK and the Netherlands were actually the first countries in Europe to adopt national action plans on business and human rights. This was really followed then by the UK Modern Slavery Act, which is one of the first transparency legislations requiring businesses to report on the actions that they're taking to address modern slavery risks in their operations and supply chains. And then more recently, we've seen the implementation of due diligence laws in Europe, such as the German Supply Chain Act, the Norwegian Transparency Act, and the French Duty of Vigilance Act. And all of these regulations require businesses to go beyond reporting to risk management processes. And we're really seeing these trends start to play out also in the APAC region, and they're really starting to follow a very similar path. So firstly, looking at voluntary initiatives that are emerging in APAC, what's interesting is that we're also seeing national action plans on business and human rights emerge in countries across APAC. To explain national action plans, if you're not familiar, so they are based on the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights, which is really the authoritative global framework for states and businesses on how they should prevent and address human rights impacts in business activities. And to operationalize these UNGPs at a state level, many countries are adopting or developing national action plans on business and human rights. And essentially, they translate UNGPs into state-level policy strategy, which outlines policy commitments, priority actions, the mechanisms for implementing these policies, and also stakeholder engagement. And you can see here on this map that there are 9 countries in APAC that have implemented national action plans, either as standalone national action plans or action plans within a broader human rights strategy, such as South Korea. Thailand was one of the first movers back in 2019, and quickly other countries such as South Korea, Japan, Pakistan followed suit. And these have spread across the region to other countries such as Nepal, Vietnam, and most recently Malaysia, which has launched its national action plan just a couple of months ago. So it's really a strong signal that many countries across APAC are really starting to commit very strongly to business and human rights. And there's more to come. Countries such as Laos and the Philippines are also developing their national action plans. And this groundwork is really crucial because it really sets the stage for more robust regulation on human rights and business. And the next stage of the maturity spectrum is then mandatory reporting. So going from voluntary frameworks to mandatory reporting. One of the examples, of course, is the Australia's Modern Slavery Act, which was enforced from 2018. So this applies to businesses which have a revenue above 100 million Australian dollars. And it requires businesses in scope to report on their business structure, their supply chain, risks in their supply chain, and also the processes that they have in place to manage and mitigate those risks, as well as how they're measuring the effectiveness of those processes. This regulation is currently under review, so it might actually become more prescriptive in the requirements for businesses and also have more wide-ranging consequences for non-compliance as well. Of course, other countries are also considering following a similar path to Australia, such as New Zealand, which has a bill on which has a bill on modern slavery. But it is unclear whether that will be passed at this moment in time. I will pass back to Isis, who's going to talk a bit more about mandatory reporting regulations.
Amazing. Thank you, Charlotte. So yeah, as Charlotte said, I'm diving into a little bit more detail on sustainability reporting. And a key global framework here is the ISSB. That's the International Sustainability Standards Board. It's operated by the IFRS Foundation, and while the ISSB isn't mandated by law internationally, just like its financial reporting kind of counterpart, many jurisdictions are integrating its standards into the regulations, which is giving it really significant influence. In fact, the ISSB's goal was really to create a global baseline for sustainability disclosures, and that's really focused on the information that investors and financial markets need. It consolidates existing frameworks like the TCFD, SASB, CDSB, and integrated reporting into really a single kind of consistent framework. At the moment, there's two standards. That's S1, the general sustainability standards, and S2 on climate. And S2 is extremely similar to the TCFD requirements if you're familiar with those. We also expect more standards to be published in due course, and that might be standards on nature and biodiversity or human capital. So the ISSB's influence is growing in APAC, and that's really likely because the IFRS has built, strong relationships with ministries of finance, likely leveraging its legacy in financial reporting. So our interpretation is that the ISSB is really viewed as kind of a natural extension of the trusted financial reporting standards, giving it that credibility and government support. So as a result, we're likely to see companies move from voluntary sort of impact reporting, like the GRI, into these kind of mandated financial sort of facing ISSB standards. And that's really in line with the kind of graph that Charlotte was demonstrating on changing maturity. If we look at the APAC context in slightly more detail, so despite the global pullback in ESG that I was mentioning in the beginning, notably in the EU and the US, APAC really continues to advance steadily. So most regulators are prioritizing ISSB S2 disclosures. And so that's the climate disclosures first. And we're seeing that in countries like Australia, Japan, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. Most APAC jurisdictions are also adopting a single or financial materiality lens, and that's very much aligned with the ISSB, which is obviously sort of financial focused. However, our understanding is that mainland China might apply a double materiality lens, which is really reflecting a CSRD style of reporting. And then just to touch on assurance as well, assurance is emerging very gradually and typically in a phased approach, and mostly limited assurance. And countries that are currently planning for this include Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, and Thailand. So overall, APAC is moving cautiously but pragmatically. So this map demonstrates the progress in the region for ISSB adoption. In pink are countries who have finalized their approach, and that means that they've kind of formally announced the adoption of the standards. And in orange are the companies who have finalized their approach, but where the regulatory status is still in progress. In terms of first movers, you've got Australia, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Singapore. And all of these countries are expecting their first aligned reports to be published in 2026. So I'm going to turn the light back on. And so if we look at these countries in a bit more detail, so in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, they've mandated climate reporting for listed companies first. But in fact, Malaysia is phasing in S1, so the general sustainability standards in a later stage. In Australia, climate reporting is mandatory with voluntary disclosures on S1. But actually it applies to the largest listed and unlisted firms first, making it the only country in this list mandating reporting for unlisted firms. In Sri Lanka, only the top 100 listed entities are in scope, but that includes S1 and S2. And Pakistan has taken a similar approach, mandating S1 and S2 and applying it to the largest listed firms. We expect Indonesia, Japan, mainland China, the Philippines, Thailand, and South Korea to also mandate the standards, and likely, taking a climate-first approach to start. If you would like more information on, particular countries, there's a link in the resources box, and you should be able to see the jurisdictional profiles from the ISSB there. So. You may have noticed a bit of a gap in the map I showed, and that's the fact that India was noticeably missing. So we thought it'd be helpful to go through India's own sustainability reporting framework, and that's the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report, or BRSR. It applies to the top 1,000 listed companies in India, and it's structured around 9 core principles, and that covers issues like governance and ethics, human rights, environmental impact. And at the heart of it is the BRSR core, and this really sets out the kind of key KPIs and metrics like greenhouse gas emissions, gender diversity, employee safety, and these data points are subject to assurance and assessment, really bringing more kind of credibility and consistency to the reporting. There's also an important value chain dimension. So companies are expected to report the information also across their supply chain and downstream partners, really to capture that kind of wider business ecosystem. And it's also designed to align over time with international standards like the ISSB, but that interoperability is still evolving. I wanted to quickly touch on the regulatory updates as well from SEBI, India's Securities and Exchange Board, because they made some adjustments last year to give companies a bit more time. So the start of assurance was deferred by a year. So it now applies to companies preparing and publishing this year. And companies can either provide reasonable assurance as was originally intended, and I think we can agree is quite an onerous task, to reasonable assurance or assessment. And that's what they updated last year, and I think it's much more of a kind of light touch third-party evaluation. Likewise, the value chain disclosures have also been refined. So this was moving from the original 75% of total purchases and sales to only those representing 2%. And that's now being phased in from next financial year. So I think these changes reflect a more balanced approach, I suppose, kind of pushing for better quality data, but also recognizing the practical challenges of implementation. And in many ways, I think we can draw parallel lines with EU's Omnibus proposal, delaying timelines and really simplifying requirements. Thanks. I will pass back over to Charlotte.
Super. Thanks, Isis. Hopefully you can all hear me. I've just used my headphones because there's a background bagpipes band playing outside the window. So that might have been a bit distracting for our audience, but hopefully you can hear me okay. Okay, so we've talked about reporting, and now we're going to think about the piece around due diligence in action. So going beyond merely telling governments and the public stakeholders what you're doing, but actually putting the actions in place. So like Europe, APAC is also seeing a potential emergence of due diligence regulation. These draft regulations are also similarly aligned to some of the leading standards, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD due diligence steps. And what these regulations broadly require businesses to do is to have due diligence aligned with the OECD due diligence steps. So that means things like having environmental and social standards in place for your business and also for your suppliers. And these are often embedded into things like your supplier code of conduct, your human rights policies, and also contracts as well. And it also means conducting risk assessments, so understanding what environmental and social risks are in your own operations and manufacturing, but also in your supply chain. They also require businesses to not only assess risks, but also manage these risks and also prevent so much as possible these risks becoming real impacts. These regulations also require businesses to have grievance mechanisms in place. This means a process is in place where stakeholders who would like to raise issues, whether they've been negatively impacted by the business or they've witnessed a breach of policy, they could have an ability then to report this to the business and for that to be addressed. If there are impacts to be found, of course, there has to be remediation processes in place as well. These regulations require businesses to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the due diligence processes that they have in place, and to take a continuous improvement approach. So really learning from what you're doing and improving along the way. These regulations don't expect you to be perfect from the get-go, but it's really about having an ambition to always monitor and improve. These regulations also require you to communicate with stakeholders who are potentially impacted by your activities. And lastly, often these regulations require you to report on what you're doing. So reporting on your due diligence activities, potentially to government authorities as well. And all of these steps are really informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement. So that means engaging with stakeholders such as employees, your investors, local communities, supply chain workers, trade unions. It means engaging with stakeholders who could be potentially affected by your business, or what we call rights holders. So that means engaging with them whenever you are developing these due diligence processes, or evaluating them, getting their feedback, and also speaking with them and making sure they're involved whenever there have been impacts on those stakeholders as well. And there's a few examples here on the screen of countries which are hoping to implement due diligence regulations. So for example, in South Korea, they have drafted a bill called the Corporate Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence Act. So that was reintroduced this year. Thailand has recently drafted a bill called the Act on the Promotion of Business Conduct, while Indonesia is reportedly targeting 2028 for introducing mandatory human rights due diligence. Of course, these regulations aren't enforced yet. They are in draft, but if passed, these regulations would probably apply to companies over a certain threshold, for example, a revenue threshold. And it's likely that there will also be consequences for non-compliance. Of course, it's unclear at this stage what exactly those consequences could be. It's also interesting to note that there's also a movement towards forced labour regulations in the APAC region. So you may have seen that recently Indonesia, in the last few months, as part of their trade agreement with the US, they have pledged to introduce forced labour regulation. That was a few months ago, and just this weekend, Malaysia and Cambodia similarly agreed to introduce forced labour regulation as part of their trade agreement with the US, which was agreed at the weekend. And it's interesting to see this trend of forced labour and trade agreements being married together as well. Of course, these regulations, although they don't specifically require businesses to conduct due diligence, as forced labour bans, due diligence is really helpful in supporting your compliance, because due diligence can help you spot and identify, assess and mitigate risks around forced labour as well. So these due diligence steps can also be very helpful in these forced labour regulations. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of move us on from thinking about what are these regulations to thinking about how they can actually then impact businesses. And the impacts manifest a little bit differently for the businesses that will actually be in scope of the regulation versus the businesses in the supply chains of those businesses in scope, so the suppliers. So I'm going to talk about a few of these here. So the first one is really about data management. Data management is so critical for businesses in scope, but also suppliers. So businesses in scope of things like the BSRS and the ISSB aligned regulations, as mentioned by ISIS, really require businesses to understand the data that they have. So businesses who know that they'll be in scope will be starting to review their data management processes, trying to understand how they can better improve data collection processes, understanding who owns what data within your business, where that data is held, and how it's all governed to make sure that it's reliable. For suppliers of course will face heightened demand for data and traceability data. Suppliers will also be required to better understand their own supply chain data. This is particularly relevant if, as a supplier, you are providing goods with high-risk materials and them to customers, as they're likely to require greater due diligence. The next impact is around having in place comprehensive and documented due diligence processes. So for companies in scope of due diligence regulation, if passed, businesses will be required to set up these due diligence processes that I've mentioned, such as risk assessment, risk management, mitigation, and having grievance mechanisms and remediation policies and processes in place. But it's not only about having these in place, you also will need to have these documented so that if you are required to report on them, you can do so easily. And this translates for suppliers as a cascading of due diligence requirements. So suppliers may be expected to conduct due diligence of their own suppliers because their customer might be requiring you to do so. You may therefore be required to undertake audits of your suppliers, and you may also be required to undertake an audit in your own manufacturing site or facility. You may also have to complete things like questionnaires to provide your customers with the data that they need to comply with the regulation. You may also be required to have in place new due diligence mechanisms, such as grievance mechanisms, as an example. The next impact is around supplier relationships. So regulations such as the due diligence types that I've mentioned, they really require businesses to work very collaboratively with their suppliers. So it's not about just overburdening suppliers with new requirements. It's about working together to actually meet these requirements together. And inevitably, across all of these regulations, because they affect the supply chain, inevitably they will require you to work more closely with your suppliers to get the data that you need. So it's really important to build a level of trust between customer and supplier. Ensure your suppliers understand what you need from them, why, and in what format. Support them in line with your requirements, and don't just cut and run. Think about how you can also build their capacity. So things like capacity building through training or signposting them to suppliers to free resources are really helpful. You might also want to think about how can you incentivize more sustainable behavior of your suppliers as well through favorable contracts, for example. For suppliers, this could mean that suppliers are facing additional contractual assurances. So you might be required to meet additional and higher standards regarding human rights or the environment. And this could be manifested in the contracts that you have with your customers, also the supplier code of conduct that you have to adhere to. And there could be also, of course, consequences for non-compliance with these standards. The last and perhaps most important part here is around cross-departmental working. And this is really relevant for businesses in scope and suppliers alike. So these regulations will require your finance, sustainability, operations, HR teams to all work together to get the data that you need and also to implement new diligence processes and policies. For example, your legal team will need to be involved in supporting the drafting of an updated supplier code of conduct. Your operations team might need to be involved to give you the energy data that you need, while HR might need to be involved to give you the gender equality data that you need. So lastly, moving on to some practical points. What can businesses do to get ready for these regulations? So we've got a few points here for you to consider. So of course, some of these regulations are in place already, but others are coming down the line. So what should you do first? Firstly, it's about really understanding the requirements that apply to you. So whether they are legal requirements, so the regulations that you're in scope of, and understanding what you need to do to meet them, what are the gaps, and when do you need to meet those requirements, by when. Also, understanding your customers' requirements is really important. If you're a supplier and you have customers that might be in scope of these regulations, perhaps as a supplier, you're a small business, but your customer might be in scope. So that might mean that you face some of these cascading due diligence requirements, as I've mentioned. So mapping all of this out is a really good place to start. Also, another point is around accessing available support. So for some of these regulations in the draft regulation, there are commitments of the government to actually provide support for the businesses in scope, but also small and medium-sized businesses as well. So make sure that you understand what support should be provided from government and use that to the greatest extent possible. Also consider joining industry initiatives, such as multi-stakeholder initiatives. These can be really useful in understanding what best practice is and learning from your peers. They can also be really helpful in developing standardized tools and methodologies to adhere to. So that helps to also create efficiencies. Also, as I've mentioned, these regulations, like the due diligence regulations, are based upon international frameworks, such as the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD due diligence steps. So those are also very helpful place to start. If you can familiarize yourself with those standards, then there'll be fewer surprises down the line when the regulations are enacted. Another great thing to consider is leveraging data tools and services and platforms to really help drive efficiencies. So for example, SEDEX, as you might know, we provide products which are very standardized. So we have a standardized audit methodology that really helps to reduce audit fatigue and reduce burdens on suppliers when conducting a social audit. Also, platforms such as SEDEX really enable data sharing amongst customers and suppliers, so making tracking of your supply chain so much easier. And lastly, and always incredibly important, is around collaboration. So building those strategic and long-term relationships with business partners is really critical. So if you're a customer and you are in scope of these regulations, ensure that you bring your suppliers along with you in your journey for compliance, and that will make your journey so much easier. Okay, that's everything from me. So I'm going to hand back to Isis to wrap us up. Thank you.
Sorry, I lost my mouse there for a second. Thank you, Charlotte. So I guess as we wrap up, it's worth asking, is it time for APAC to really take the title as frontrunner in sustainability regulation? Progress across the region is definitely uneven, but momentum is accelerating. And what we're seeing now is really a wave of pragmatic, regionally grounded frameworks that are moving from voluntary to mandatory. And each market is really tailoring its approach to local realities while still keeping sight of global alignment. And in relation to that, the region has largely aligned with ISSB. And that was what was intended by the IFRS, rather than creating kind of its own separate system like the EU has. And that's what makes APAC's pathway perhaps more streamlined and definitely more finance focused, and arguably easier for companies that are operating across borders. We're also seeing a shift in mindset. So from responding to pressure from international investors or buyer markets to instead kind of establishing homegrown sustainability regulations that reflect domestic priorities. And that's really going to support these countries and their respective organizations to become even more competitive in the global market. So while APAC might not be the global leader in sustainability regulation right now, it's moving deliberately and steadily closing the gap, learning from global experiences and focusing on what's practical. Thank you. I will hand back over to Tom for the Q&A.
Super. Thank you, Isis. I think, thank you both, Charlotte and Isis. I mean, from what we've seen today, it's pretty clear, right, that sustainability regulation in APAC's moving fast. It's gone from that voluntary good practice to mandatory rules, and it's no longer just following global standards, it's starting to shape them as well. And what that means for businesses, it means that visibility, due diligence processes, and verified data are going to be essential. So that's been really interesting. Thank you. And I think what important thing to take from our European counterparts as well, it's always going to be the companies that don't just tick all the boxes. They treat compliance not as the ceiling, but as the floor, and really sort of lead in human rights and environmental due diligence. That gives them the competitive advantage as well. So we'll go into the questions portion of today's webinar. If you have any questions, please do continue to leave them. We'll ask as many as we can with the time that we have. So I will kick us off. So I've got a question here. Charlotte, I think this one's going to be best for you. What are some practical first steps for setting up a due diligence system in countries like Thailand or South Korea, where the requirements are still evolving?
Great, thank you. Yeah, very practical question. I think one of the things that I would really recommend is to look at the international standards that I mentioned. So familiarising yourself with the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights and the OECD's due diligence steps are really helpful in understanding, firstly, what is meant by supply chain due diligence, what does good practice look like? And usually where businesses start is that they firstly get a good understanding of what current systems they have in place. You might already have in place processes to risk assess your customers. For example, whenever you're onboarding a supplier, lots of companies do some risk assessment to understand what potential risks are at that supplier site. So understanding and working with your teams to really map all of that out is a good place to start. And then you can start to build on that. And usually businesses start to do this by firstly looking at their policies to understand what current commitments do they have and should those be strengthened? And then thinking about, well, then how do you actually monitor this policy? And often that's done through things like risk assessing, risk management. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that I would recommend with starting off with, and then really from there thinking about all of the next steps in the due diligence cycle.
You're on mute, Tom.
I was on mute, amateur. It's good bound to happen. There's a question for you, I think, Isis. How does ISSB differ from CSRD?
Great, thank you. I'd say that there's probably two differences if we're looking really at the
Oh, I think we may have lost Isis. Charlotte,
enterprise value. Can you guys hear me?
I think you just broke up, Isis.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
I think that seems better.
Yeah? Okay, cool. So I was just saying that if we look at the standards themselves, there's probably two key differences. One is in terms of materiality. So the ISSB applies a financial materiality lens, and that's really looking at risk to enterprise value. The CSRD instead looks at double materiality. So that's, again, that financial risk that ISSB has, but also, on the other hand, an impact materiality lens. So the impact that your business has on people and the planet. So in that way, they're very different. Then the second difference is probably in terms of the kind of number of standards that they have and the kind of structure that they have. So as I mentioned before, ISSB has two standards, and that's S1, the general sustainability one, and then S2 on climate. And when you're reporting on sustainability topics that aren't climate, you're just using the S1 standards. And those, they don't have like a long list of fixed KPIs for every topic. Because it's general. So I think you're asked to use your own judgment and also look at other kind of standards like SAS. On the other hand, ESRS actually has 12 standards, and those are across the E, S, and the G, so environmental, social, and governance. And for each of the topics that you determine to be material, they give you, they tell you exactly which metrics and data points you need to report for each. So it's much more, I guess, rigid. I would call the ISSB perhaps more flexible, but then ESRS is definitely more helpful in terms of comparability. The one place where they're very similar is the climate standards. They're both based on the TCFD. They both ask for emissions data, your targets data, information on your transition plan if you have one, whether you've done scenario analysis to really quantify the financial risks of the financial effects of climate risks. So if you're already reporting on TCFD or ESRS E1, you're in a really great place to report on S2 for ISSB.
Super, thank you. I think there's another sort of reasonably aligned question to that. Would APAC region consider uptake of CSRD and ESRS as reporting standards?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because I think, there's lots of firms, given that the CSRD has this like extraterritorial impact, meaning that if you've got significant business operations in the EU, you can still be in scope of the regulation. I understand that lots of companies outside of the EU have been worried about CSRD and trying to prepare for it. But the CSRD is really a European directive, and so are the ESRS. So I think that's why countries in APAC and also, around the world, there's, I think, 36 jurisdictions that are taking ISSB into scope in their own jurisdictions. So yeah, I would say that it's unlikely that APAC takes a CSRD approach because it's so European. In fact, the ISSB is really it's supposed to be an international baseline. I think other things that make it so valuable is the fact that it's finance focused. I think that's much less contentious in some countries than having something that's also impact focused. Yeah, I'll end it there. But I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I've got another question. How can I support my suppliers, especially those who might be resistant to new reporting or due diligence requirements? Charlotte, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. I can take this one. Yeah, always a tricky one whenever suppliers are resistant, and there might be a number of reasons for that. It might be less so resistance. It just might be a case of lack of capacity or internal knowledge or capabilities. So I think the first step is really speaking with your supplier and trying to understand why the supplier might be having some difficulty in aligning with your requirements. So if it is to do with, capabilities, then it might be a case of you working with that supplier to understand what capabilities do they need to build and whether your internal teams can support them to build them. Because oftentimes it's large companies that have a much greater amount of resources internally to develop internal capabilities around reporting and due diligence. So it's always great to think about how you can transfer some of that knowledge to your suppliers and build up their knowledge and skills as well. It could also be a matter of capacity. These teams within suppliers, they might not even have anybody in the team related to sustainability. It might be very lean. So it's also about understanding their capacity restraints and what's reasonable for them. And so I think there's a case for reasonableness. If the supplier is very small, it might not be reasonable to have really heightened expectations for them and putting very strict timelines on them. It might be a case of working more collaboratively together. So yeah, I would say collaboration is always critical for this one. Other things that could work as well is around incentivization. So sometimes there's been a lot of cases where customers have developed measures to incentivize more sustainable behavior of the supplier. So that might mean, giving them higher giving them a higher price per gram of a product provided, or liter of a product provided, say if it's milk, for example. So giving them more favorable pricing if those standards are met is also an option, and perhaps providing a scale to work to. So yeah, I would say that's something to think about as well, is whether you can build like an incentivization framework to help your supplier on that improvement journey, and also being reasonable. Your supplier might not change its behaviors overnight, but that's okay. So long as they are working towards improvement, that's what you really need.
Super. Isis, do you have anything to add to that one?
No, thanks, Charlotte. That was great.
Amazing, thank you. We have another question. With suppliers across multiple APAC countries, how can SEDEX's platform help us monitor performance and demonstrate ongoing due diligence to regulators and stakeholders? Charlotte, do you want to answer that?
So for this one, sorry, can you repeat the question? Sorry, I think I missed the start of it.
That's fine. With suppliers across multiple APAC countries, how can SEDEX's platform help us monitor performance and demonstrate ongoing due diligence to regulators and stakeholders?
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so for if you're using something like the SEDEX platform, it's really helpful in you can essentially use the platform to understand risks at those supplier sites, and ask them, if the supplier site is high risk, then asking them to undertake different due diligence steps. So that might be providing you with more data through our self-assessment questionnaires, or we also have an environmental self-assessment questionnaires. And really the purpose of those is to understand how these risks are managed and mitigated at the supplier site level. So really collecting that site level data so you can understand what's going on at the ground. We also have our SMETA audit methodology. So customers can request their suppliers to undertake a SMETA audit, which is a social audit at the site. And that's really to understand if, and identify any potential risks or potential issues, and to also understand if the supplier is aligning with international standards, such as the ETI base code, which is a translation of the ILO conventions, and also to understand if they are aligning to relevant local regulation as well. And what's really helpful for that for a supplier is that they can understand what these issues are, and then they can understand what they can do to improve. So it's really helpful for suppliers in their improvement journey, as well as supporting customers to better manage their own risks. If that answers the question.
I think that answers the question very well. I think that now is, I'm getting loads of messages to say, right, we've gone over, we've still got loads of questions. What I would say is, if you've still got questions, we'll be sharing out the recording, we'll be sending out the slides via your email address. So if you have any follow-up questions, please do respond to us via that email. I would like to thank both of our speakers for joining us today. Really interesting talk. And I would also thank to everyone who joined and took time to join us today. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day or your evening, and speak to you soon, hopefully. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.